Pat Brown, I was looking through my logbook the other day and it occurred to me I've flown more than one type of aircraft in my career. There's the one I started on and I got comfortable with and I soloed where I instantly became uncomfortable because I was alone for the first time.
Yeah.
But, I realized all these different types, I've never just jumped into an airplane and gone. I've always gone through some type of transition training, even if it was the same airframe, but a much higher horsepower or had significantly different avionics. Have you had a similar experience or are you so talented at this point, Pat? You can just jump in a mystery airplane and go.
Yes, Jamie, as a matter of fact.
Why do I not believe you?
I'm so glad that you recognize that. My buddies call me Chuck, you know.
Oh,
And no, that's actually true. I don't know how many different types of airplanes that I've flown over the years, but I started in a 150 and then a 152 and then a Cherokee 140 and then a Warrior and various 182s and some tailwheel airplanes and a Malibu and a couple of Cirruses and just over the years a bunch of different kind of airplanes and in fact a single place tailwheel airplane.
oh
And
wow.
there is no transition training in a single place. So what I told you earlier was not entirely untrue. But there are, and we can talk about it now or a little bit later in the podcast, but there are ways that you can make that transition into an unfamiliar airplane and do it safely. And again, we can talk about it now or later. But I actually have gotten in two airplanes in my life that there was no way to have proper transition training.
That was a thing during World War II. The P-47, the P-51. They didn't P-40. They didn't have two-seat variants.
Right.
You went to ground school and you read the book, and that's a great place to start in our civilian world when you're going to be transitioning to another airplane. Looking through the POH, getting a handle on the systems and any configuration differences. Good example I'll give you. 172 I owned, a short field or soft field takeoff required 10 degrees of flaps. The 182 I had, it was 20 degrees of flaps.
Right.
And you've got to read the POH so you know. So all those numbers, your VY, VX, stall speeds, all that thing, have a good handle on those, even if you make a cheat sheet. And I once flew for a flight school that had 5 different types on the line.
Yeah.
And I'd be bouncing between them. I made cheat sheets that went on my knee board. So I had everything for that airplane available to me when we got in the airplane because I didn't want to, miss one for the other. And transition training is a real thing. They don't all act the same, even though as they glide gracefully overhead, it might look like they are. But when you're in the cockpit, they're actually a bit different.
Yeah, and some of those 172s that you mentioned, some of the other airplanes as well, we talk about a short field takeoff, may or may not require flaps depending on whether there's an obstacle.
Yeah. Well, and even when we talk about flaps, Cessna and Cessna's a good example. The 150 might have manual flaps, might have electric flaps. The 172 might have manual with the emergency brake handle kind of thing, or it might have electric. And you might have that little paddle where you have to hold that down for a count of 3 to get to a position, or you might have the paddle where you can set it to a position and it just transitions. Knowing what that is, because I have read of accidents where people thought they had pulled the flaps up, but all they'd really done is hit the paddle and it stopped. It didn't go. So they're trying to take off with full flaps. Not going to happen with a full load.
Yeah, and some of those airplanes, particularly the Cessna models, some of them have 30 degrees of flaps and some of them have 40 degrees of flaps too. So that's a huge difference.
Oh yeah, 40 degrees of flaps on a landing. You're pretty darn nose down.
Yeah.
That's an interesting experience.
Yeah,
Well,
for sure.
how about avionics, for instance? Because many of the airplanes out on the flight line were built in the 50s and 60s and
Right.
70s. And many of them have had panel upgrades over the time. So it's not the way it was when it left the factory. And a Garmin is not a Dynon, is not something else. I mean, You have to learn how to use that equipment. That can be a challenge.
Yeah, you've hit on something that is probably, arguably, more of an issue than switching, let's say, between an 182 number one and 182 number two. Um, as we were talking earlier, all 182s are not necessarily alike.
Mhm.
Um, uh, the difference between a 1956 182 and a 1976 182 can be night and day. But even the difference between a 182P and a 182Q model, maybe not so dramatic. But what if the 182P model has an old King stack with a KLN 94 GPS, that's nothing more than probably about a paperweight these days, but it still works, right? But
Yep.
but it's not easy to use versus the Q model maybe that has a G3 Touch, Garmin G3 Touch or something like that in there with a 750 and a 650 and a GFC 500 autopilot or something along those lines, versus the Avidyne stuff that's on. I mean, now you're talking about really an entirely different airplane, even though it looks exactly the same as the P model or the Q model. I mean, they look identical, but now it's an entirely different airplane. What I was telling you earlier, when I bought the 182 that I have now, and I've had it now for 2.5 years, almost three. It's hard to believe. It probably took me, I would guess, conservatively 15 or 20 hours flying that airplane before I became comf- comfortable, reasonably comfortable with the avionics in it, because it was a much more sophisticated avionics suite than I had in the previous 182 that I had, and completely different than was in the Cirrus or even the Comanche that I've got. And even to this day, despite the fact I've probably got, I don't know, 1,500 hours, 2,000 hours, maybe in 182s, various 182s, there are times flying my own 182 that I have to stop and think for a second. Wait a second, what is it I want to do, and what button do I have to push to do it? Even though I'm fairly comfortable with these avionics now.
That's a real thing because one of the things we deal with in flight training a lot, and I yesterday I did a flight review for a guy, and I go out of my way to distract him on the way out to the practice area just to see how they'll react to it. But there's not much more distracting than being head down in the cockpit trying to get that box to do what you want it to do, especially if you're in busy airspace, and it doesn't even have to be other air traffic. It could be a flock of buzzards, Pat.
Yeah,
If you're not looking outside, bad things can happen, and it's really hard to just learn on the fly how this thing works. It's much better to spend the time on the ground. There are even trainers you can put on your computer so you can
right,
go through it. But
right,
I'd rather sit on the ground with a CFI walking me through how this box works. Where I'm paying for the time, that's okay because it's going to make me competent to fly this airplane. Much the same way as I could go from a PA 28 140 Cherokee to a PA 28 235. Same airframe, same interior, might even be the same instrumentation. But that jump in horsepower is a significant thing. So left turning tendency is going to be much more profound. I'm going now to a system where the throttle doesn't control the tach, the throttle controls the manifold air pressure gauge.
yeah,
And I've got to start manually setting the prop for an RPM and
right,
setting the manifold pressure. That kind of thing, it might seem like, oh, same airframe, no big deal.
right.
Whole different workload, whole different set of planning. And it's not like it's an insurmountable challenge,
No, not at
but
all.
it's not something you want to learn on the fly.
No, and you've got engine management issues that are arguably a little bit more critical with that constant speed prop. If it's not a turbocharged airplane, you're going to be losing engine manifold pressure for every 1,000 feet you go up. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to gain it back for every 1,000 feet you come down, and you better understand that simple physics fact, um, in order to best manage your power on the way down. Otherwise, you're going to be wondering why, after a descent of several thousand feet, I'm not coming down at the 500 feet per minute I was before. Or if the autopilot's controlling that on a rate of descent, why am I speeding up? Why am I 10 knots faster now than I was 2 or 3 or 4,000 feet above? Well, it's because you got more power.
Hmm.
So engine management becomes a much bigger deal. Those big bore engines, and I don't mean to make it sound like engine management is unimportant in a fixed pitch propeller airplane. It certainly is, but it becomes more important in some of these big bore engines. The possibilities of damaging that engine become significantly greater if you're not managing your fuel air mixture properly and monitoring that manifold pressure.
Yeah, and I found I even, when I had the 182, I would manage it differently depending on what I was doing. If
Mm-hmm.
I'm going someplace, I'm probably set at like 23 squared, something like that, 23 inches, 2,300 RPMs. But if I'm taking somebody up for a sightseeing flight and we're really not going beyond 15, 20 miles, I might still be at 2,300 RPM, but at 17 or 19 inches because
Sure.
I'm burning a lot less fuel. And my point wasn't to cover a lot of ground now. It's just to get up to altitude and then loaf along. So instead of burning 12 or 13 an hour, now I'm burning 9, maybe
Yeah.
10.
Yeah.
And I'm
Exactly.
saving a couple bucks. I'm doing things so that my passenger's happy and we're getting to see things and my engine is well managed. But that's that type of thing. And even, you mentioned earlier, you were talking about some aircraft have 30 degrees of flaps, some 40 degrees of flaps. Some people, because they are used to flying something with 30 degrees of flaps, they'll just hit that to the bottom step and, okay, I'm going full flap. Well, full flap doesn't mean the same thing in every airplane.
That's exactly
And
right.
and that's going to change the performance dramatically.
Yeah.
So and of course, I tend to like little tail draggers with low horsepower engines, which means they don't have flaps at all.
Right.
So
Right.
we're going to have to make sure we've got the slip procedure down and getting ourselves straightened out. So yeah, transition training, whether you're going up to bigger, more capable aircraft or down to lighter, more basic aircraft, you have to transition train if you want to be safe. And maybe your insurance company has something to say about this too.
I guarantee you the insurance company will have something to say about it. Oftentimes, it's nothing more than a CFI checkout.
Hmm.
But let's say you're going from a fixed gear airplane to a retractable gear airplane. When I did that years and years ago, if I'm not mistaken, the insurance company required 10 hours of dual, not just a CFI checkout, but 10 hours of dual. And I think they required 5 hours of solo after the dual before they wanted me carrying passengers. That's not unusual at all.
Yeah, I almost bought an RV9 last year. I was very close to buying it until I talked to the insurance company. And I needed 10 hours of dual in the RV9 before I could solo it. And my problem was the RV9 is a relatively new airframe. I couldn't find a CFI who had the experience to give me the dual. I
Yeah.
literally couldn't buy the airplane because while I could make the purchase, I couldn't legally fly it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sort
Well,
of thing happens. So,
certainly not from an insurance standpoint.
right.
So, yeah.
And
So,
insurance matters to me, Pat.
insurance does matter. There's another matter of let's say that you did learn to fly in a 150 or a 172 or something like that, where you're flying down to a full stall landing. A proper landing is the yoke is almost all the way back or all the way back, and you
Mhm.
touch down theoretically at about the time the airplane's ready to stall. I mean, that's the way you're supposed to do it. It's the way that most people learn how to do that or should learn how to do that anyway. But you don't necessarily try that in a Bonanza
True.
or a Malibu. You really don't do it that way. You're really almost flying those airplanes onto the ground at a low rate of descent, to be sure. But you're not necessarily trying to hold those airplanes off until you get a full stall landing. So the landing technique in a 150 or 172, I mean, the basics are the same. You're starting out at at a descent, and you're rounding out, and you're pulling the nose up so that you don't have the mains or the nose wheel. But the similarities may begin to diverge at that point. I'll just put it that way.
Well, even going from high wing to low wing or low wing to high wing, the sight picture is different when you come into the pattern. The way even a Piper Cherokee with a Hershey bar wing stall is completely different than the one with the taper wing.
Yeah.
And they look like a very similar airplane, but they're very different. So,
Yeah.
not to belabor a point, but some people get under the impression that I can go from this airplane to that plane no problem because they're both 4-seat light aircraft. And
Yeah.
just nothing could be further from the truth. You really do need to transition train. Even if you flew one of these 20 years ago and you're pretty sure you remember it, spend a couple hours with a CFI, really get up to speed, because there's nothing worse than being in the airplane and there's a system failure or the weather turns or
Right.
your passenger gets sick and you find yourself behind the airplane.
Yeah.
Now it really sucks.
Now it sucks. I will tell you just a quick story here before we wrap it up. And that has to do with the transition into those single place tow planes. I learned in a Citabria, 2-place, instructors in the back seat. And great instructor, Joy Bowden at Texas Tail Draggers, one of the best flight instructors I've ever flown with in my entire life, did a great job of training me at Citabria. And then I was going to the glider club and we had a Pawnee. A Pawnee has 235 horsepower Lycoming engine and a cowling that from the cockpit extends a good 6 or 7 feet to the propeller. So you're sitting way back in the airplane. And I remember getting that thinking, what have I gotten myself into? But I had talked to Joy and she said, look, start out the way we did in the Citabria. And that was basically just kind of taxiing up and down the runway at gradually increasing speeds, and then get the tail wheel up and then get the tail wheel back down again. And, kind of get used to the feel of the airplane. And that's a great thing to do. The runway was a mile long. It was 5,000-foot runway to our glider club. So I did exactly that. Kind of started out back and forth and gradually increasing speed, getting the tail up until I felt kind of comfortable with it. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to try one more high speed run before I take off. Well, apparently I was a little bit too aggressive on the throttle and ended up taking off. And I said, well, I'm committed now.
Yeah.
Anyway, so went up to altitude and did some stalls, steep turns, slow flight. I mean, all those things that you do, and came back to land. And I have to tell you, I was more than just a little bit nervous on that, because
Oh,
I didn't
sure.
have probably 20 hours of tailwheel time, and I'm flying an airplane now that has got way more power, and I'm sitting way further back. Relative to the CG of the airplane, sitting way further back.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be, it was a non-event. But and then when I had to transition into the ag wagon, it was much the same thing. You get into the airplane, it's a bigger airplane, you sit lower in the airplane. The cowling again is 6 or 7 feet long out there, and everything feels entirely different on that airplane too. But if you find yourself having to find, there certainly could be cases where you don't have a choice. If you find yourself having to get into an airplane that for some reason it's not possible to have an instructor with you, maybe the RV9, for example, if insurance had not been an issue and they just said, we want you to have 10 hours of solo before you carry passengers. Well, all right, you can't find an RV9 pilot. Well, maybe you find somebody that has some RV6 time,
Yeah.
or RV7 time, or something like, at least it has some RV time where you can talk to them. Are there some handling characteristics about this airplane that I need to know about that are different than a 150 or 172 or whatever I'm coming out of?
Mm-hmm.
So find somebody that has some experience in that airplane, and then take it slow. Start with just taxiing the airplane around to get a feel for the steering, free castering nose wheel or not free castering nose wheel, especially if you don't have any experience in a free castering nose wheel.
Yep.
It takes a while to get that to where you're comfortable. And then just kind of gradually increasing your taxi speeds till you kind of get a feel for the aileron, the rudder. What does it take to get the nose up? What is my pitch attitude going to look like when I get ready to land? Well, maybe a high-speed taxi with a little bit of back pressure, almost like a like a soft field takeoff technique where you're getting the nose up. Oh, this is what the pitch picture probably should look like. So there are ways that you can, I'll say, check yourself out in an airplane if there really doesn't look like there's a way that you can get proper transition training. But it shouldn't be undertaken lightly, and it should start with the books, just like you said. What's my VX? What's VY? What's VSO? I mean, all of that stuff. So
Well, and
anyway, that
you bring up a really good point. Assuming most people are not in a single seater, they're in two-seater, four-seater, and they're with a CFI or an owner or somebody who has experience. The reason you go up and do that slow flight and stalls and steep turns is not just to check a box and meet a requirement. You want to know how this thing performs. What's it feel like? You don't want to feel the first experience of the airplane being low and slow and at a low power setting when you're 100 feet off the ground descending. You want to
exactly
get that sense when you're up 3,500 feet. What's this thing really feel like? What's its responsiveness? How well do the ailerons work when it gets slow?
right.
All that stuff should be in your mind before you get committed to a landing. And that thing you're talking about with the incremental taxiing down the runway, going faster, getting the tail up, that's kind of like when you fly a new home built that
Yeah,
nobody's ever flown before. We
yeah.
don't just take off and see what happens. A lot of incremental steps. So yeah, transition training into anything, not only is it important from assurance perspective, it actually gives you more confidence and you know how to fly this airplane, which is much better than adding too much throttle, being in the air and going, uh-oh, what's going to happen now?
Oh yes, not a good feeling.
Hey, thanks, man. Always good to talk to you. You are a wealth of information, and I appreciate you sharing it with me, let alone all these people watching,
Uh,
because it really does help me get better. And, I'm just trying to be as good a pilot and as high quality an instructor as the great and honorable Pat Brown of
oh,
Bliss,
geez,
Texas.
Jamie, you embarrass me.
Hey, thanks so much for watching, y'all. Click the like button. Leave us a comment down below. Have you ever done transition training into a different airplane and found something really surprising about it that you never envisioned? Because I have. Click the subscribe button because we'd love to have you along for the ride. And we'll see you back here next time on Madpropsaero.
Adios.